Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third session on the Zionists. Tonight is one of my personal favorite topics. We'll actually divide it into two sessions. This class and next, I want to explore with you the life and legacy of the one and only Theodore Herzl. I just mentioned to a couple of you that there's a relatively new biography put out by the Jewish Live series of Yale University Press by Derek Penslar, a biography of Theodore Herzl. There are, to the best of my knowledge, roughly speaking, 200 biographies of Theodore Herzl that have been written since his passing in 1904, and deservedly so. The man changed the course of Jewish history, and everyone should know all there is to know about him because he was such an extraordinary man. And I'll say this at the beginning and maybe circle back to it at the end or at the end of next session. He was not just extraordinary and unique, but totally unlikely, right? If you had to point to one person in the world, at the end of the 19th century and say, this is the Jew that's going to change the course of Jewish history. So I don't think he would have been on your top 10 list. I'm not sure he would have been on your top 1,000 list. And we'll talk a little bit about, what makes me say that as we move on. So part of the challenge of learning about Herzl or studying a little bit about Herzl is that you know everything, right? So we've all learned the story of the Dreyfus Affair and Theodore Herzl and the Zionist Congress. So that is a challenge because we have all of that kind of knowledge sitting in our back pocket, but it's also an opportunity to build on a subject matter that we care deeply about and that we already have a head start with. So let me say a little bit of background about Theodore Herzl. This part no one ever teaches in day school because it's too tragic and too sad and too unbelievable. Herzl's life, from a retrospective perspective, if I can say that, was almost Jobian. It wasn't Jobian because he didn't live to see most of the tragedies I'm about to describe, but the whole of Theodore Herzl's inner life, just everybody ended in tragedy. Okay? So a little bit of background, and then you'll forgive me. We'll talk about the unhappy, unpleasant, tragic part of Herzl's life up front, and then we'll move to the heroic part as we move forward. So it's Herzl's birthday month. Herzl was born on May 2nd, 1860. And he was born, as you know, in what today is Budapest. So Budapest is separated in two halves, Buda and Pest, separated by the Danube. The Jewish community for many years had a vibrant community in Pest. And surely, if you've ever been to Budapest, you visited the Dohány Synagogue. The Dohány Synagogue, last time I checked, is, I think, one of the largest synagogues in the world. If you've been there, it's huge and cavernous and 2 pulpits and 3 levels and 2 balconies. Okay, so it was known as a Neolog Synagogue. So what did it mean to be Neolog? So Neolog, the closest equivalent in the 21st century in America is like conservative Judaism. So there was traditional Judaism. Again, we're in Hungary in the middle of the 19th century. So you have traditional Judaism, which adheres to the principles of halacha as they've come down to us for the better part of rabbinic history. And then there's a burgeoning reform movement, which is interested in acculturation and assimilation and not too interested in halacha. And Neolog carves out this kind of middle. So they want to be traditional, but they're also interested in modernity, and they're also interested in forward progress. So there's an organ in the shul, there would never be an organ in a traditional shul. There's always an organ in a reform shul. So there's an organ, but it's only played by a non-Jew. Okay. So there's a traditional liturgy, and separate seating, but they're moving forward. The other thing I'll just say, and again, this has analogs in the 20th and 21st century, is that there's a kind of yawning chasm between the aspirations of the movement or the clergy on the one hand and the lay people on the other. So if there's a kind of move toward or interest in traditionalism among the leadership of the movement, that's not always reflected in the lay people. So the Herzls were members of this synagogue, but they themselves were like the furthest thing from traditional Jews. They were acculturated, assimilated, German-speaking Jews. So Herzl grew up, around the corner from this synagogue. I think his, birthplace. You could still visit it today. His parents are members of this community, but how often did they go to shul and how observant were they? So not very often and not very observant. Where had they come from? So as I mentioned in one of our earlier talks, his father's family had migrated from Serbia, from Zemun. They'd come to Bohemia in 1839. And how did they get to be Herzl? Their name had been Label. What's label? When you add an L in Yiddish to a Yiddish word, it means little, right? So shefela, like my little sheep. So label means level, right? My little lave, my little heart. So how do you say heart in German? Heart in German is Herz, right? So my little heart would be Herzl, and hence the name. But again, the sense that they Germanized to become more like the folks among whom they were living in Budapest in 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and Herzl's born into this community in 1860. Okay, so his father was a very successful a businessman, Jacob Herzl, and Jacob Herzl and his wife have two children. Theodore, and he has a sister. Theodore Herzl has a sister, Pauline. I'll say the first tragic piece is that Pauline dies as a young person in 1878. She dies of typhus. So what happens to Herzl? I'll just fast forward a little and then circle back to his family. So he attends law school. He practices law briefly in Vienna. He becomes a journalist and a playwright, and that's the career that he makes for himself. Beginning in 1891, he becomes the Paris correspondent to the Neue Freie Press. Okay, so his family has moved to Vienna. And the Neue Freie Press is like the New York Times of its day. It is the most prominent, most important, largest circulating newspaper in Vienna, in Austria. And he becomes the Paris correspondent. Okay, so your man in Paris. And again, that's how we know what he was doing there in 1895, covering the Dreyfus affair. But we'll talk about that a little later. Okay, eventually he rises to become the literary editor of the newspaper of the Neue Freie Press. 1889, he married a woman named Julie Nashauer, who also came from a very prominent and very wealthy family. It was, by all accounts, a very unhappy marriage. I'll just show you one picture because I've not actually seen it before. So this is a picture of Herzl. This is already toward the end of his life in 1902. That's Herzl in Vienna at his desk with his mom. Okay, and apparently his mom did not help his family life. It was a very strained relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. And throughout the relationship, it was just one series of unhappinesses after another. So here's the tragic piece. Bear with me because it's so uncomfortable and so upsetting. The Herzls had three children. Okay, Paulina was the oldest child, and she was, of course, named after Herzl's sister, who had died at a tragically young age. Paulina was a lifelong heroin addict who died of a drug overdose at the age of 40. Their second child was named Hans. Hans had a very troubled relationship with his parents and with Judaism. He abandoned his Jewish identity and converted several times to various different denominations of Christianity. At some point, he circled back to Judaism, and upon the tragic death of his sister, he killed himself. He shot himself in upon hearing of his sister's death, or after his sister's funeral. Paulina had no children. Hans had no children. There was a third child, Trudy. Trudy suffered her entire life from depression. She was married. I'm not sure how long she was married for, but she was married, and she and her husband had a son, Stefan Theodore, who was named after Herzl. I'll circle back to him in a second, but her life was cut short. She and her husband, or her ex-husband, as the case may be, were murdered by the Nazis in Theresienstadt. So at this point, there was one surviving heir of Herzl, who bore his name, right? Stefan Theodore, whose middle name was for his grandfather. And at the age of 17, he was sent to England in 1935. Again, his parents saw the writing on the wall and knew that it wasn't necessarily safe to remain in continental Europe. So they sent him to England for his safety. He became a Zionist and became a captain in the Royal Artillery, in the English military. He actually visited Palestine. He was very interested in the work of his grandfather. We have some quotation of his. He once said something or wrote something to the effect of, "I went to Palestine to see what my grandfather had begun, or to see the state that my grandfather had founded," something like that. In 1946, he took a position, like a government position, in Washington, D.C. He actually immigrated to America and was living in Washington, D.C. It wasn't clear to many people what had happened to their relatives over the course of the Holocaust. At some point after the war, news came back to Stefan that his parents, that his family had all been murdered by the Nazis. Upon hearing that news, he took his own life. He jumped off a bridge in downtown Washington, D.C., and with his death, there ended the biological legacy of Theodore Herzl. All of his children were gone, and his only surviving grandchild was also gone. There are no relatives. There are no descendants of Theodore Herzl in the world today. Okay, so as I say, tragic and almost Jobian. Again, he didn't live to see it. All of his children, he died at a very young age, so he didn't live to see his children perish. But when you zoom out from a macro perspective, just one tragedy upon another in the family of Theodore Herzl. And I might just note, you'll forgive me if it becomes morbid, but there's this just stunning trend of people with whom Herzl associated, whose lives were cut short. Okay, and I'll just mention a couple others in the course of our session tonight. Okay, let me pause for a second and say something more about Herzl's relationship to Judaism. And this is an amplification of the comment I made a few moments ago about how unlikely it would have been for someone to forecast that Herzl was going to play this decisive role in Jewish history, because his relationship to Judaism was so tenuous, at best. So again, his parents had a nominal relationship. They members of the Neolog Synagogue, but not active. Their identity was as acculturated German-speaking members of the Viennese upper class. So for some reason, historians are very taken up with the question of whether or not Herzl ever had a bar mitzvah. So it's a machlokes. Some historians say, of course he had a bar mitzvah and his parents belonged to the synagogue, and how could he not have had a bar mitzvah? And other historians say, no, he hadn't. We have no record of it. And Herzl was such a fanatical diarist. He put everything in his diary. He never mentioned anything about a bar mitzvah in his diary. Must never have happened. Okay. I don't know if Herzl had a bar mitzvah or not, but I can tell you he was not from the shul goers, okay, not as a young person and not as an adult. It just wasn't part of his identity. This is a kind of odd story about the birth of his son. Herzl himself refused to circumcise Hans when he was born. Later on in life, as an adult, Hans ended up having a circumcision. So a kind of bizarre epilogue to that story. But what kind of identified Jew doesn't circumcise his son, right? That tells you something about his relationship with Judaism. And I'll just share with you, he wrote an essay. He was an essayist, and he wrote an essay called Judentum in 1896. This is already post-Dreyfus Affair, and he's formulating his relationship to Judaism and to the Jewish people, and he's identifying. So I'll just share with you this excerpt. It's on your source sheet. As source number 1. Okay, Judentum in German, we translate it as Judaism, which is what it means, but it's a very ambiguous term, almost a little like in English. Like when you say Judaism, so I think what most people mean when they say that is, Judaism as opposed to Christianity. It's like a religious connotation to the word. In German, Judentum, it's like, it could mean Judaism, it coan mean Jewish culture, it could mean the Jewish people. It's a kind of broader term and doesn't have a specific religious attachment. Okay? So what does he say in this essay called Judentum? I'm just saying that kind of linguistic introduction, so you don't think that he's writing an essay called Judaism. That's not quite what it means. So he says, we Jews, we're noticed, we're a historical group of people who clearly belong together and have a common enemy. This seems to be an adequate definition of a nation. I do not think the nation must speak only one language or show uniform racial characteristics. This quite moderate definition of nationhood is sufficient. We're a historical group of people who clearly belong together and are held together by a common foe. That is what we are, whether we deny it or not, whether we know it or not, and whether we desire it or not. So, we chafe against this kind of definition today. It's, how could we all, the only thing that holds us together is anti-Semitism, or we're bound together by the people that are against us. That's not enough. We need to have an affirmative identity. What does Judaism, stand for? And on this formulation, Herzl says, no, that's not really necessary. It's not about one language. There's nothing in here about one land. We're like a historical group. What binds us together is functionally, this sense of anti-Semitism, because whether you're East European or West European, or you're secular, or you're Hasidic, it doesn't matter. The anti-Semites don't make such distinctions. So we don't have to make such distinctions. We're one group. It's a historical group. Judaism is about identifying with that history, the fact that we're a kind of people, as opposed to, there's nothing in here about Torah, there's nothing in here about commandedness, there's nothing in here about covenant, right? That's like, totally the opposite of, Kalisher and Alkali, whom we've been discussing. This is a very, very secular, political kind of identity that has nothing to do with Jewish religion per se. And based on everything we know, the formulation I would sort of venture is that his original thought, like until we get to the Dreyfus Affair and until we get to sort of this turning point where it is, we'll see, it was really his thought or his aspiration, which was the thought and aspiration of kind of most acculturated Jews in this moment, that racial prejudice would sort of disappear in an enlightened age when Jews reached full equality and full emancipation and became full citizens, right? So, like we're making progress, and give it a little more time and we'll make even more progress, and then anti-Semitism will be gone. It'll be outmoded. Okay. So let me just pause here and ask if there are any questions or comments about sort of the background, the family, the history, and Herzl's relationship to Judaism. Okay, so let me fast forward now to 1894, 1895. Everyone knows the famous story of the Dreyfus affair, and I'll just say, by the way, if you haven't been there, next time you're in Israel, you should visit the Herzl Museum. It's excellent. It's at the foot of Har Herzl. It's relatively new. It's just, I think, in the last 10, 20 years that it opened. It's great for adults. It's great for kids. And a lot of Herzl's artifacts are there. They have some books from his library and his desk, and it's a fascinating place to visit. Okay, so obviously the Dreyfus affair looms large and factors prominently in the story of the evolution of Theodore Herzl. Again, if you'd stopped him in the street in 1894 and said, "What do you think of the Jewish people?" and be like, "I don't know, that's interesting. It's not that interesting. It's a piece of history, but what's my interest?" So what changed, at least according to the sort of standard telling of the story of Herzl, what changed his attitude was the Dreyfus affair. So what was the Dreyfus affair? In a nutshell, Alfred Dreyfus, captain in the French army, which again, like, you wouldn't have been able to say that sentence a century earlier. Right? What Jew was a captain in any army, right, until the second half of the 19th century? Right? It's a fascinating phenomenon. So he's a proud Frenchman, a secular Jew, who's a captain in the French army, and he's accused unjustly of treason. And the principal reason he's accused of treason is because of the prevailing anti-Semitic atmosphere in this moment, and he's convicted. In kind of a sham trial, he's convicted of passing military secrets to the Germans. Okay, so I think he was from Alsace, and Alsatians, even though Alsace belonged to France at the time, so it had been German territory. So could they be trusted? Okay, so that's a piece of the puzzle as well. So after this trial, so there's a spectacle. We don't do this anymore. If somebody's convicted of, in a court martial or something, so they're stripped of their rank, and you might read that they're stripped of their rank in their newspaper, but there's not like a ceremony where that happens publicly. Dreyfus was publicly humiliated, right? He's pilloried, and he's literally stripped of his rank, and he's paraded through the streets of Paris before being incarcerated, and mobs gather and start shouting things like "Death to the Jews." And it's an extraordinary kind of moment to behold that, this was the home of the French Revolution, and there's supposed to be egalite, and what happened to this dream? It seems like we've gone off the rails here, and there's a mob of people shouting "Death to the Jews," accusing, right, fundamentally baselessly, accusing this innocent Jew of what they consider to be one of the worst offenses imaginable. So in the regnant history of Dreyfus, the regnant history of Herzl, it was the Dreyfus affair that was the turning point or the genesis of political Zionism. I'll come back to that in 1 second. I just want to share a fascinating parenthesis, a fascinating aside. Emil Zola. Okay, so I know you know this, but it bears repeating because it's just so extraordinary, and just there's such a moment of standing up for principle that it just has to be noticed and called out. Right? You could tell a story, you could tell a history of Herzl without ever mentioning Emil Zola, but I can't. I have to mention Emil Zola. Okay, so Emil Zola was one of the most prominent and one of the most famous authors of his generation, and he was not a Jew, but he writes in 1898 this famous article called J'accuse. Okay, so my French is not very good, but you can read the title for yourself. So it's a letter to the President of the Republic of France by Emil Zola. So, and it's it's a front page open letter to the president of France. So functionally, Emil Zola decided of his own accord to stand up for Alfred Dreyfus and to stand up on principle against anti-Semitism. So he writes to the French president, accusing the French government of falsely convicting Dreyfus and accusing the French government of nothing less than anti-Semitism. And I think this part we know, but the next part I think is not as well known. Okay, so it wasn't just that he was standing on principle. He actually had a goal. His goal was the following. His goal was to draw the accusation so broadly that he would essentially force the government to sue him for libel, which is what they did. Okay? And his plan was, once the suit for libel was filed, the supporters of Dreyfus would then have a new opportunity to acquire and publicize just how to acquire the evidence and publicize just how baseless the original case was. And functionally, that is what happened. So at great personal cost, Zola was arrested and incarcerated. Why? So that he could functionally force the French government into being in a position where they couldn't deny a retrial to Dreyfus. He would bring to light in the course of his own libel trial, right? If you're suing him for libel, it means that he doesn't have a leg to stand on. Right? So he has to prove that he does have a leg to stand on because the original case is predicated on baseless information. So he precipitates a retrial of Dreyfus, and Dreyfus eventually is retried and released. Anyone know, by the way, the epilogue to the story? Know what Dreyfus did after he was found innocent? He rejoined the French army. Okay, amazing, right? Just to think of that, epilogue to history. But this is the heroism of, just imagine an Emil Zola, in the 21st century. The man is willing to go to prison. He's not Jewish, right? Just on the principle that the government had done something so heinous and so un-French. Okay. Close parentheses. Back to Herzl. So there's been some controversy in the recent historiography to revise the story and to question whether or not Herzl's interest in Judaism actually predated, or his interest in Zionism actually predated, the Dreyfus affair. So, the old history says, read the diary. Herzl says something to the effect of, I saw what happened. Now, he was the man on the ground. He's the foreign correspondent in Paris for the Neue Freie Presse. So he's covering the case as a journalist. So he said, I'm covering this case, and how could I not be moved by the fact that the crowds are chanting death to the Jews on the street? So, diaries are tricky sources from the perspective of, academic history. On the one hand, they're amazing, because they give you insight into the inner life of the author that you'd never have from another source. Somebody says X, well, why'd they say it? Go know. Maybe it's because of their background, maybe it's because their principal, maybe they had no choice. But the diary says why I said it. So now you know. So on the one hand, diaries are amazing. On the other hand, one, of course, has to appreciate that the diarist is not only writing for himself or herself, but presumably has some sense of who might be reading this diary at some point in the future. So I should have mentioned earlier that Herzl is not just a journalist; he's a playwright. He's a failed playwright. We'll come back to his plays a little later, but he's someone who's moved by theatrics. So the fact that he may have written something in his diary, it's not that it was untrue. It's not that he made up. It is true, but he may have exaggerated. He may have formulated in such a way which would have advanced his own agenda. So if you take his diary at its word, it was the Dreyfus affair that moved him. But some more recent historians have said, already, he had written an article on French anti-Semitism as early as 1892. Also in the first half of the 1890s, there was a politician named Karl Luger who was, a rabid anti-Semite and basically won his Viennese municipal election on an anti-Semitic platform. That surely had gotten the attention of Herzl. That's his, family's city. So these are, prior to the Dreyfus Affair. And I'll just share with you an excerpt from an essay that he wrote. It was actually a drama that he wrote called Das Ghetto in 1894. Okay, so this is kind of pre-Dreyfus. And already in 1894, he writes the following. This is source number 2 on your sheet. So this is just a summary of the of the play, and then here you have the quote at the end. So November 1894, he dashed off a play, Das Neue Ghetto, that represented his first major literary effort directed exclusively to the Jewish question. The Jewish question means, how do you solve the problem of anti-Semitism in continental Europe? The central character in this Tendenstück was a high-minded Jewish lawyer, Dr. Jacob Samuel, who was engaged by a Christian aristocrat as an attorney for a mining company. Okay, it's a fictional play. So the Jew is the lawyer, and he works for this Christian aristocrat. When the mine owned by the Christian aristocrat flooded and the company went bankrupt, its owner angrily denounced Samuel as Judenpack, Jewish rabble. Okay, he gets upset at his Jewish lawyer, he starts cursing him out, and in the ensuing duel, mortally wounds Jacob Samuel. With his last breath, Samuel cried out, Jews, my brothers, you won't be allowed to live again until you get out of the ghetto. So, again, this is Finn. And I wonder who his audience is, but Herzl already, again, before Dreyfus, is interested in the question of what it means to be Jewish in this moment. Okay, whatever the case may be, it seems at the very least that the Dreyfus Affair accelerated and accentuated Herzl's Zionist thoughts, and even the word Zionism, is a little anachronistic because a movement hasn't coalesced. But 1895, he gets started on this book, short book called Der Judenstaat, which means something roughly like the Jewish state, or maybe actually a better translation is the state of the Jews. Okay. But he writes in 1895, publishes in 1896, and we'll look a little at it in a second. But fundamentally, he argues that the Jewish people should leave Europe for Palestine, which is their historic homeland. Okay, and he's taken by this notion that the Jews are possessed of a nationality, and that to be a nation means to have a nation state and to have a home of one's own. The only way to kind of solve the Jewish problem, to overcome the problem and the challenge of anti-Semitism, is to create a place where Jews can live Jewishly without hindrance. And the only way to do that is to create a Jewish state. Okay, so Der Judenstaat is the magnum opus that he publishes, and it's a sensation. So let me share with you just a couple of important excerpts. Of course, it's translated into many languages very quickly. And I'll just share with you one excerpt that Herzl wrote in preparing the book. Right? He says, for some time now, I've been engaged in a work of indescribable greatness. It has assumed the aspect of some powerful dream, but days and weeks have passed since it has filled me utterly. It has overflown into my unconscious self. It accompanies me wherever I go. It broods above all prosaic conversation. It disturbs and intoxicates me. What it will lead to is impossible to surmise as yet, but my experience tells me that it is something marvelous, even as a dream, and that I should write it down. Title, The Promised Land. Okay, so you get the sense that he is possessed by this idea, right, shaken to his core, the notion that something needs to be done about the Jewish problem, and the solution is a Jewish land. So let me just share with you a few excerpts. He writes the following. This is source number 4 on your sheet. Okay, and again, we could spend a whole semester learning Der Judenstaat, but just to give you a flavor, if you haven't read it recently, a number of excerpts. The idea I've developed in this pamphlet is an ancient one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. The decisive factor is our propelling force. And what is that force? Plight of the Jews. I'm profoundly convinced that I'm right, though I doubt whether I shall live to see myself proved so. Those who today inaugurate this movement are unlikely to live to see its glorious culmination. How prescient. But the very inauguration is enough to inspire in them a high pride and the joy of an inner liberation of their existence. We're going to launch it. I don't know if we're going to get there, but we're going to launch it. The plan would seem mad enough if a single individual were to undertake it, but if many Jews simultaneously agree on it, it's entirely reasonable, and its achievement presents no difficulties worth mentioning. The idea depends only on the number of its adherents. Perhaps our ambitious young men, to whom every road of advancement is now closed, and for whom the Jewish state throws open a bright prospect of freedom, happiness, and honor, perhaps they will see to it that this idea is spread, right? Think of all the people who are suffering now as a result of anti-Semitism. They can't advance themselves, but now they could join our cause. And imagine if there were a Jewish state where they could advance themselves. It depends on the Jews themselves whether this political document remains for the present a political romance. If this generation is too dull to understand it rightly, a future, finer, more advanced generation will arise to comprehend it. I may be misunderstood in my own lifetime, he says, but at some point people will get it. The Jews who will try it shall achieve their state, and they will deserve it. I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one, even though it sometimes takes these and other forms. It's a national question, and to solve it, we must first of all establish it as an international political problem to be discussed and settled by civilized nations of the world in council. And this is going to be very important to his mission, which is the sense that the solution to the problem is a political one and requires people placed in in prominent positions of political influence. It's going to take those people to advance this agenda. We are a people, one people. We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It's not permitted us. We're trying, it's not working. They're still shouting death to the Jews in the streets of Paris. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifice of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences or her wealth by trade and commerce. We're good citizens. What do we have to show for it? In our native lands where we've lived for centuries, we're still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in their country. Sometimes we're there longer than the non-Jewish citizens, and they still consider us outsiders. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has endured such struggles and sufferings as we have. Jew baiting has merely winnowed our weaklings. The strong among us defiantly return to their own whenever persecution breaks out. Wherever we remain politically secure for any length of time, we assimilate. I think this is not praiseworthy. Israel is our unforgettable historical homeland. 2 last paragraphs. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and in our own homes peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there for our own benefit will redound mightily and beneficially to the good of all mankind. Okay, there's something kind of larger and prophetic here. It's not just about a solution to the Jewish problem. The solution to the Jewish problem is going to redound to the benefit of the entire world. Therefore, I believe that a wondrous generation of Jews will spring into existence. The Maccabeans will rise again. And that's how he sees himself. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who wish for a state will have it. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil and die peacefully in our own homes. The world will be freed by our liberty, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there to accomplish for our own welfare will react powerfully and beneficially for the good of humanity. Okay, so Der Judenstaat. The book is republished. It's published originally in German. It's republished in French and in English. Writers like Hess and Pinsker had written about some of these ideas decades earlier. There's not like Chidushim in Der Judenstaat, But Herzl didn't know about them because he had never studied, Zionist thought before. He was coming up with this on his own. The book was banned in Russia, but somehow Jews managed to obtain smuggled copies. And I'll just share with you the reaction of one Haim Weitzman, okay, Russian Jew, to the book. Okay, and again, just this notion that it's not about the novelty of the ideas, it's about the force of how they are articulated. It was an utterance, source 5, it was an utterance which came like a bolt from the blue. Fundamentally, the Jewish state contained not a single new idea for us. We've been thinking about this. Not the ideas, but the personality which stood behind them appealed to us. Here was daring, clarity, and energy. The very fact that the Westerner came to us unencumbered by our own preconceptions had its appeal. We were right in our instinctive appreciation that what had emerged from their Judenstaat was less a concept than a historic personality. Okay, here was Herzl, right, not just articulating an idea, but one could already begin to see the force of a man who took this idea so seriously that it wasn't just academic, he was actually going to act upon the idea. Robert, question?
Yeah, actually, a couple of questions. Going back to the play from a few years before this, where the character dies saying, "Jews get out of the ghetto." Yeah. At that point in his life, or in Herzl's life, is he having that character say that because he's continuing in his views that notwithstanding all the anti-Semitism, everything will be okay as time goes by. Jews will acculturate, maybe assimilate, although he knocks that in the Judenstaat, but they will be seen once they're out of the ghetto and accomplished as free and equal citizens. Or is he essentially saying get out of the ghetto and get to a Jewish state, as a precursor to the Judenstaat? And the other question is interesting enough is that although a certain amount of what's in there, or at least in the excerpt you read, sort of is consistent with the worldview that you stated initially, that what Herzl saw as uniting all Jews is the enmity of the rest of mankind. There are clearly some sort of biblically and religiously inspired passages in that, and so how did he make that leap? He could have, it was many years later, but he could have easily said, let's set up a homeland in Kenya because that's where it's available.
Yeah, so good questions. When it comes to Das Ghetto, I think there's some ambiguity there, right? Like, it's time to get out of the ghetto. So did he mean get out of the ghetto and start agitating for political Zionism? Or did he mean let's get out of the ghetto and we'll finish acculturating? And as soon as we finish acculturating, we'll have solved the Jewish problem because, the Christian neighbors will see their Jewish neighbors as equals. So, I think that is a little ambiguous in the closing line of the play, and that's why it's not such a slam dunk to say that, oh yeah, sure, even before Dreyfus, he was he was agitating for political movement. I'm not sure it's so clear. So there's something there, but what it is, I think, is not entirely clear. And what propels him into the next stage. So that's sort of the $64,000 question, right? He goes from zero or next to zero to 60, so to speak, very, very quickly, right? And that's why the regnant history is that it's the Dreyfus affair, because that's what he writes in his diary, and seeing this just lit him a fire and launched him into this obsession. Functionally, he calls it an obsession. He just can't get past this idea that he needs to solve this problem of the Jewish question. So before we run out of time, let me just share with you two kinds of reactions. One is already here in the Weitzman reaction, but so much of the world has been kind of like waiting for, so much of the Jewish world has been waiting for someone like a Herzl to show up on the scene and share this kind of message. And then I'll share with you the kind of opposing reaction. So Howard Sacker, who wrote a book called The History of Israel, I think puts this very well when he describes what it is that Herzl accomplished with the publication of Der Judenstaat. He says in source 6, Herzl's Zionism was unique in other respects as well. It was Zionism articulated for the first time by a man of the world, a distinguished political observer and broadly traveled journalist. Now, I didn't mention this before, but it's important to note that Herzl was already world renowned. He was, a top journalist, and it's a little bit of a loose analogy, but just think of like the most famous New York Times columnist. Okay, it's David Brooke, whoever you want to conceive of. So it's not just like somebody showed up on the scene out of the blue and wrote a book called Der Judenstaat. It's coming from a name that everybody knows because everybody reads the best-selling newspaper in Vienna. So David Brooks writes a book, so it becomes a bestseller like almost instantaneously. It's the same thing. So look who's writing this. He says, there are people who wrote these kinds of things before, formulated these ideas. And a little, we talked about it last time. It's like, it's Tzvi Kalisher. So he's also advocating for a return to Palestine. Anybody listening to him? Yeah, here and there, po v'sham, a little drop in it. But, worldwide movement, he's not able to do that. But if you're Herzl and you're the literary editor of Der Neue Freie Press, so, right, the world is your oyster. So he's getting attention. He says the Judenstaat, therefore, in its transfixing eloquence and orderly exposition, introduced Zionism to European readers, to editors, to university men, statesmen, and other molders of public opinion in the kind of language they were accustomed to reading. Right? More important yet, Herzl stood alone in his attempt to resolve the Jewish question not merely through the dramatic and far-reaching notion of a Jewish state, but through the active collaboration of leading European powers. From the very outset, he projected Zionism into international statecraft. He said, I'm one of you. I speak your language. I can get an audience with fill in the blank. We'll talk more about it next week. But the president, the prime minister, the Kaiser, the Pope, right? I'm one of you. I traffic in these circles. I'm part of the intelligentsia. I'm part of the elite. And again, the highest, the Hochdeutsch and the highest possible, most eloquent formulation. Right? He speaks this language, literally and figuratively. So he is entree into the world of national diplomacy, and that no Jew dreaming of a return to homeland ever had before. So on the one hand, right, this is earth-shattering and totally transformative, and there's audiences all over Western, Central, and Eastern Europe who are very excited about the prospect of Herzl. They don't even know what it is yet, but the idea of a Herzl leading a project, to inspire a return to a national homeland. At the same time, and I think this is equally important because it gives such a sense of, the other side of this coin. Okay, I just want to share with you a quote from Stefan Zweig, also one of the most famous and world-renowned authors of his time, a acculturated secular Jew. So Stefan Zweig, eventually he and Herzl were friends. So he writes the following. He says, he was a kid at the time. He said, I was still in gymnasium. It was high school, right? I'm still in gymnasium when this short pamphlet appeared. But I can still remember the general astonishment and annoyance of the middle-class Jewish elements of Vienna. What has happened, they said angrily, to this otherwise intelligent, witty, and cultivated writer? What foolishness is this that he's thought up and writes about? Why should we go to Palestine? Our language is German and not Hebrew, and beautiful Austria is our homeland. Are we not well off under the good Emperor Franz Joseph? Do we not make an adequate living, and is our position not secure? Why does he who speaks as a Jew and who wishes to help Judaism place arguments in the hands of our worst enemies and attempt to separate us when every day brings us more closely and intimately into the German world? Okay, so Stefan Zweig captures, right, a whole other sentiment, right, of the acculturated, German Jew who says, Palestine, Palestine is a backwater. We've worked so hard to get where we are. We have equality and we have rights and we have citizenship and we speak the language and we can open businesses and we have access to arts and culture and things are great. We don't need to go to Jerusalem, right? Vienna is Jerusalem. Berlin is Jerusalem. Why would we want to go anywhere? So again, just to come back to my kind of crude analogy, imagine if David Brooks or some other world-renowned columnist one day published a book about displaced Ukrainians founding a new homeland on the island of Corfu. It's like, what? What happened? I was so excited. I open up the paper and every week I read the column and it's a little witty and it's a little funny and there's always some new idea and he writes so eloquently and it's such nice English and such nice prose and he's so learned. And then one day you open the paper, it's like, what happened here? This was our man in Vienna. This was our man in Paris, the Jew who had made it. And he's writing the front page articles for the most prominent newspaper in Europe. And he's off his rocker. He's crazy, right? We're trying to march forward. And at the end of this quote, I love it. He says, right, every day brings us more closely and intimately into the German world. There's another advance, and we're like heading forward out of the ghetto and into the normal world of German society. And now this guy, right, who was like our lodestar, we all read him, we all looked at him, and he was a role model for us and for our kids. And we told them, you could grow up one day and be Theodore Herzl. You could write for the Freie Press. It's unbelievable. And now he's like, what did he just do? He just right? He went off into a total bizarro twilight zone. Palestine, Zionism, homeland, what are you smoking? So this was the alternate reaction to Herzl's Der Judenstaat. So, right, there's like everything, right? There's the supporters and the detractors, and you can understand the passion behind each of them. Okay. So I'm going to pause here. We're going to pick up, please God, next time and talk about the continuation of the story with the First World Zionist Congress and the attempt, right, over the next 8 years of Herzl's very short life to found the Jewish state and to talk about the legacy that he left behind. So I'm going to pause here, but I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes and take some questions.